John. How you doing?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Good. All right. So we are live. We are broadcasting live from Facebook, but this is also our podcast and our genetic type podcast. And you sent over to me a topic that we wanted to talk about today. And it's not like we prepare for it, right, John? We just
Right.
kind of go right into it and kind of go off of each other. And we're going to be talking about oxalates and could it be oxalates? Oxalates may be on your radar, but you're not really sure exactly what it is. You want to know more information about it. And then what I like is what you put in there, John, in terms of how is it related to the genetic component, specifically the toxic accumulator type. So I guess why don't we just start off with a little bit about what exactly oxalates are and go from there.
Okay. Yeah. So, oxalates are something that our body produces, but we also get oxalates from diets. Okay. And the problem is some people that consume a diet of foods that are high in oxalates tend to absorb those oxalates at a higher rate. And there's gene factors that play into that. And the problem lies is now you've got that abundance of oxalates that have been absorbed into the body. They bind to calcium and they create a calcium oxalate crystal. And that's all fine and dandy, but there's a lot of things that can happen when there is an abundance of calcium oxalate in the body. Worst case scenario, if one of those calcium oxalate crystals or stones gets big enough and gets stuck in the kidneys, that's what a kidney stone is. And so people that have had kidney stones understand what oxalates are. They understand that, hey, if they've seen a good urologist or nephrologist, that they need to understand dietary components to decrease the likelihood of a future stone. The problem is you can have a lot of other chronic symptoms that are triggered by an increase of oxalates in the body. And these oxalates may never get big enough to eventually get stuck into kidneys, but they could be systemic in the body and wreak havoc, driving a lot of chronic issues, a lot of chronic symptoms, a lot of things that maybe you've been suffering with your whole life, even from a laboratory or diagnosis standpoint, where oxalates can be a layer or a big trigger that's driving that.
Yeah. So, I mean, a couple really basic things you said is you can produce them on your own and you can eat them. So let's talk about some of the misnomer or like common mistakes people that are eating healthy or thought otherwise they were eating healthy. What exactly are they getting it from in their diet?
Yeah. So, and the problem with oxalates is there's a lot of really healthy foods that are very high in oxalate content. I got my kind of Fab Five we talk about that are the five highest: spinach, beets, parsley, Swiss chard, rhubarb. Those foods are very, very high in oxalate content. But other, leafy green vegetables, berries, dark chocolate, coffee, beans, potatoes, nuts, those are all foods that are very, very high in oxalate content. The problem is a lot of other diets that people follow, like maybe a paleo diet, or they're doing maybe a GAPS diet. Those are foods that they're consuming on an ongoing basis, and they wonder why there's limitations to what they're doing. They wonder why, hey, I'm not responding this way when everybody else I know, maybe responded a certain way with a certain dietary component, because maybe in that person, that oxalate burden was there to start with, and maybe that person has gene factors as well that allows that oxalate burden to hit them a little bit harder from an inflammatory process than maybe the next person.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what really is key, John, is you don't pigeonhole yourself into a corner when you hear about what the stereotypical or prototypical symptoms are and then throw the baby out with the bathwater. So meaning a lot of people will do that with histamines as well. Well, I don't get runny noses or in allergies, I'm okay with pets. But meanwhile, the same pathology is happening. And really you are kicking up the ocean floor, and depending on where the weak links in the chains break will depend on where the actual outward symptoms show up. And I think that's important because a lot of people may say, well, I don't have oxalates, I don't have quote unquote fibromyalgic pain, or I don't have kidney stones. And I think it's really interesting with our Perfect Storm Summit, we did an interview with Susan Owen, and she was talking about how she first went down the autism spectrum funnel or hole, rabbit hole, and then all of a sudden was looking at this thing called oxalates. So maybe talk a little bit more about like I know with people that are exhausted and burnt out and they have muscular weakness and fatigue and they don't have a lot of endurance. I said, hey, you really got to think about potentially an underlying oxalate issue. So what would be some of the things that they would look for if that, besides testing, which we'll get into,
Right.
but as far as subjectively, like what's the clinical picture?
Yeah. So I've got a kind of a hit list of things that when I hear a client reflect back as a symptom or something that they've been dealing with all their life ongoing, kind of a light bulb goes off that, hey, oxalates is something that we got to investigate to actually consider that it's a factor, or at least check off the list, right? To see if it is a piece of the puzzle. And I'd probably say about half the time, maybe more than half the time, with people that have these ongoing complaints that I'm going to mention here in a second, oxalates are a layer. It may not be the only layer, but it is a layer, and I consider it actually a foundational layer because of what oxalates can do in the body from an inflammation side of things, and what type of deficiencies oxalates can create as well, which I'll get to in a second. But the usual thing is obviously the stones, right? If somebody's got a history of kidney stones, tonsil stones, family history of that as well, that could be something. Hey, maybe you don't develop the oxalate crystals to get big enough to get stuck in the kidneys, but there could be an abundance that's maybe on the radar if you do have a family history of kidney stones. But some of the other things, you mentioned fibromyalgia, right? We know that these oxalates our body tries to eliminate, and we typically eliminate through specific detox channels. We do eliminate them through kidney function, through the bladder, through urination. That's why the stone gets big enough and gets stuck in the kidneys. That's where that can be problematic. But you can have these oxalate crystals anywhere in the body, and we know that if you're detoxing or eliminating a higher abundance, that means what's in the body is elevated as well. And these oxalate crystals can get embedded in muscle tissue, right? And if they get embedded in your muscle tissue, then what happens is you light up like a Christmas tree in terms of pain. And that kind of mimics a lot of, those fibromyalgia or chronic pain issues. I've had numerous fibromyalgia patients that have, been on medications for decades with fibromyalgia. We figure out it's an oxalate issue and start addressing the oxalate issue with, protocols and dietary changes, and their pain levels start decreasing for the first time in decades. And so it can be a big, big factor. You mentioned Susan Owen's research, in the world of autism. A lot of research shows a lot of these kids that have really messed up guts and increased candida, tend to have high oxalates. And we know that those oxalates can cross the blood-brain barrier and create a lot of inflammation in the brain. And so whether it be a kid, that has some type of neurodevelopmental issue, or even an adult that's got any type of neurological complaint, would it be brain fog, some type of, neurological autoimmune issue, oxalates have to be on the radar. And we talk about also from an oxalate standpoint, if anybody's got like reoccurring candida issues, if you got reoccurring candida issues, oxalates is maybe something you definitely want to investigate as maybe a trigger for that standpoint. And then there's a couple other things that are maybe not the usual suspects, but the things are really kind of, spark my interest or kind of lead us down that rabbit hole. Number one, anybody's got a thyroid issue. Okay. There's research showing that through autopsies or biopsies, that 80% of people actually have oxalates in their thyroid tissue. So how does that create disruption of mineral or thyroid function that can lead to thyroid conditions? Also, people have recurring UTIs. Big red flag that oxalates have to be on the radar, because you're usually dumping or eliminating these oxalates through the urogenital tract. And if you're eliminating these kind of jagged crystals that aren't big enough to get stuck in the kidneys, but you're peeing them out, they're going to create irritation. And once that irritation's there, it's going to nick your tissue, create red blood cells, create bacteria growth, and then you go to the doctor for a UTI test and it's positive. But the cause or the trigger was your body just dumping those oxalates in the first place. And then with that too, with females, any type of vulvodynia or pain with intercourse, like those are big red flags that oxalates could be an issue, just creating irritation in that area. And then the other things that are really red flags for me is if I hear somebody that's tells me that they've been told that they're anemic their whole life. okay, or that they've had, or they're just taking a boatload of magnesium, and the minute they stop taking the magnesium, they feel poor. And magnesium is like a big crutch to help pain levels, help energy, help digestion. There are certain mineral components where oxalates can create deficiencies if those oxalates are in excess. And so if I see or hear someone with, reoccurring issues with iron, reoccurring issues with magnesium, or they're very dependent on iron and magnesium, there's a red flag that oxalates have to be on the table, because we know what oxalates can do in terms of kicking those essential elements out and creating those deficiencies in the first place.
Yeah, and I think that was like a couple light bulb moments that were going off all over our heads when Susan was talking for our Perfect Storm Summit, especially you. Like, you had all these crazy light bulbs going off. But what I like to say on that too is, given that if you look at the oxalate, just the compound that it looks like when you break down foods, it's a scavenger, and it really will displace minerals. And that's where I would also add, with people that are exhausted and burnt out and have what we call a demand and supply problem, they're just not producing energy at the level that they need to. Oxalates are mitochondrial disruptors.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the day, if you don't have enough gas in the tank, and we talk about that with our new product line, John, in terms of, hey, we got these 7 genetic types, but also every single one of those types have a foundational challenge of making enough ATP. So if you're exhausted, you're tired, you have muscle pain, I really like the idea with what you're saying in terms of anemic, and also even the idea of when you are having a lot of musculoskeletal pain and or pain on urination. Typically people think cystitis, but they don't have the oxalates on their sort of on their radar. So as far as, okay, so now as far as what we do want to link it to the genetic component,
Mm-hmm.
but before we do that, so what does someone do? Because I think, let's just say they want to, it confirms with their history. They've been seeing different doctors, and maybe the doctor didn't mention it, or they did. How would you confirm it, first of all?
So there's a couple things you do. Number one, you can test, and organic acids, test your Great Plains is one of the best ways to do that. There are, you could get a requisition to go to LabCorp to look at oxalates. Probably not the best way to do it based on the reference ranges, but organic acids can give you insight into oxalate, but it also can show you too if there's other factors that you have, maybe, a primary or secondary hyperoxaluria issue, which maybe want to, look at genetic factors, on top of that. But measuring can give you an insight. And you also mentioned kind of the mitochondrial aspect, right? On an organic acids, you're looking at Krebs cycle function. You're more often than not, if not all the time, when oxalates are elevated, you're going to see certain things like your malic levels elevated, or your aconitec levels, off, which tells you that, hey, there is some mineral depletion happening, and those oxalates are a huge stress that's causing, dysfunction in your mitochondria, which is affecting, energy production. So testing is going to give you confirmative if it's an issue or not, right? But if you, if it's not in the budget to test right out of the gate, you could simply follow a low to moderate oxalate diets, increase magnesium intake, get an Epsom salt baths, a couple of times a week, heavy salt baths. And if you start feeling better, well then, hey, oxalates are definitely on the radar. And then maybe you do want to investigate to have an objective measure to determine, hey, are you doing enough? Can be more done, as well as what are some of the other triggering effects that causes oxalates to elevate in the first place, which kind of leads into kind of that toxic accumulator genetic type. Because in my opinion, there are triggers besides genetics, besides dietary aspects, that do cause the body to absorb those oxalates at a higher rate, buffer some of the chemical stress on the body.
Yeah, and just a sort of side note, because I don't want to go down this particular hole, but when we talked with Susan as well, and she did her research, and she talked about the inflammasome and how we have this whole big picture now of the gut microbiome, and you mentioned candida yeast, mold, triggers like that. And there is a bit of a controversy in terms of the people that do the Great Plains and their opinions on why candida is there, and potentially how to help that. Maybe we can just talk real quick about it. But this was Susan's take, which I think is really interesting. when she was doing the research on these autistic kids and she found that their oxalate levels were high, then the light bulbs were going off in her head about, well, a lot of these kids are doing antibiotics or they're doing diflucan and they're doing antifungals, only to find out that they were killing off the things that were helping the oxalates be able to be dumping, and they were getting a paradoxal, or at least what they didn't think would be a result, by killing off that candida by making those oxalate levels higher. So maybe we could just kind of touch on that briefly, John, in terms of someone who may have, you know, we would definitely think candida way before we would think about oxalates, and then they
Right.
go on a candida cleanse, and then now they're dealing with a whole new set of challenges. So maybe talk about just kind of what happens there.
Yeah, so I've seen that too, like pre and post testing with patients, with kids that are on the spectrum, right? And they come back, this candida components in there. They're still working with like a pediatrician or medical doctor, and they decide they want to do nystatin or diflucan to kind of control the yeast. And then you redo an oxalate, or an organic acids test to kind of measure some of those fungal markers, but the oxalates are much worse, right? Because we know that they're the gut microbiome is something that regulates absorption of oxalates. It's going to regulate, some of those bacteria that are there that help the elimination of oxalates from food. So if you're doing things that's going to disrupt that microbiome, you lose kind of that defense that helps that regulation and that dumping or detoxification aspect. And so, it makes sense based on what Susan, says, and something I, seen for years too, where, antibiotic therapy, fungal therapy does create an increase in the oxalates because you're losing, some of those key bacteria that are needed to regulate the absorption as well as regulate the detoxification aspect. And if you lose that, then you're going to have a higher affinity to absorb those oxalates. And then there's more of a need to understand the dietary limitation, because if not, then that oxalate burden increases. And then all those other things from a symptomatic or inflammation side of things will become that much worse, because that increased oxalate burden on the body. And so, yeah, that was something great, that Susan talked about, and, something that clinically I know I see, and I'm sure you see as well. And it's something that, hey, there's maybe a priority aspect, right? Do you want to do things to fix the gut microbiome, right? Because she even talked about alternative methods, like, microbial, like herbals and things of that nature, right? That can have the same effect. So before you go down that road, do you want to do some things to get the oxalate burden under control? Because if not, then what's going to happen is you can make your symptoms worse, because, hey, you're trying to kill off bad bacteria, you're trying to create a better, balance in the microbiome, you're trying to decrease the candida burden. But if that oxalate burden is out of control to start with, well, that could be a big factor of like why the minute you kind of get through with that protocol, symptoms come right back, because that oxalate burden is there, driving inflammation and symptoms in the first place.
Yeah, and that begs to be repeated. So basically what you're saying is that a lot of people, like, that's why this talk is so important, because it has to be on your radar. It has to be your usual suspects. It has to be one of those things where, whether you're dealing with an exhaustion, fatigue, burnout problem, fibromyalgia, where it's just a loose diagnosis, you're thought of as the crazy person that the doctor doesn't really want to engage with. And then you do some research on your own, you start doing some gut protocols, and you kill off some of the things that you're finding, only to know that those microbes were out of balance to support the oxalate. And now what you're doing is you're making a bigger imbalance. So if you don't know it's there, don't know how to approach it. And we'll get into that, because we want to just give you walk away action steps that you can do, like identifying what your oxalate burden is on a daily basis and slowly bringing the percentage down per week, so that as you drop your oxalates, now all of a sudden those commensal bacterias or other types of populist pathogens that are in the GI tract are also going to go lower. So that's a key point, really, really big key point. That could be the herbals that you're taking, that your provider has given you, and it's making you worse. So, okay, so let's talk about, John, now the genetic component, because I think that's really key. So what's the genetic component? How does it even relate to this?
Yeah, so some people do have gene factors that they have a higher susceptibility to form oxalates, right? You know, you know, those are the genes that we really don't get into, because it's like you have them or you're not, and usually you're going to want to measure oxalates because you're going to have usually those symptoms if you have those gene factors regardless, right? You're going to have a history of kidney stones, you're going to have some of these symptoms we talked about. The gene aspect just confirms that, hey, maybe you know, kind of this low oxalate lifestyle may have to be something that is kind of more of the norm, more rather than kind of a short-term kind of fix, right? I think that's where some of those gene factors like the HOGA-A1 genes, the SPP1 genes, you know, some of those genes that deal with higher affinity for oxalate formation, get somebody an understanding of if they do have high oxalates, that might be something that, you know, understanding dietary means going forward has to be on the radar, right? They have to understand that if they loosen their reins too much, once they start feeling better, there's a high likelihood that oxalate burden is going to accumulate again, and they're going to be right back where they started. But one thing from a genetic standpoint that I've seen is it kind of falls back into what we talked about, like those disruptors of the gut microbiome, is besides just the things that disrupt gut bacteria, like antibiotic use, right? The things, you know, food sources, things of that nature. One thing that I've seen that has been a big factor is people that have detoxification issues, okay, or have, or what we call the toxic accumulator, where they can't get rid of metals, they can't get rid of chemicals as effective, and there's a lot of reabsorption, which that in turn puts stress on the gut microbiome and then creates an environment for increased oxalate absorption. And then you know, it's kind of one of those things with the candida and the oxalates, which came first? You know, the candida come first, the oxalate come first. You know, is there kind of you know, kind of both happen kind of simultaneously to buffer each other? There's still a lot of debate on that. But what I've seen is a lot of people that have reoccurring candida issues, or people that have increased oxalates. A lot of times another stressor is that they tend to have poor detoxification factors, and they store metals and chemicals are exposed to at a higher rate, which then causes the body to kind of go into chaos and say, hey, we're going to try and buffer this. And one way we can buffer this is let's increase certain mineral components. And one of those mineral components it tries to do is the formation of calcium oxalate. And that creates a lot of other issues, but that could be a sign too that somebody could be a toxic accumulator and have a lot of impairment in some of these genes that deal with detoxification. And what I've seen a lot of times over the years is somebody that has issues with oxalates, they do really, really good on the diet. They increase magnesium intake, they do these other kind of protocols, buffer the oxalate burden. The minute they get away from the support, the oxalates come back with a vengeance, right? Or over time, they're still following a low oxalate diet, but then 6 months, a year later, it's like those oxalates start slowly creeping back up. And a lot of times we know going into it, or we didn't discover that there are underlying issues like, you know, stored mercury in the tissue, stored aluminum, you know, stored glyphosate. There's a chemical burden on the body that's causing this oxalate formation in the first place. And that's where with your genetic concept, you know, with somebody that is that toxic accumulator genetic type, you know, one of the initial dietary protocols that someone should follow is to consider a low to oxalate diet until proven wrong if you have a known metal or chemical burn on the body that you've been dealing with off and on your whole life.
Yeah, and that, you know, John, that is the beauty of your intelligence, is like seeing like, why are these people not responding? There's something else that's clogged. And in this case, we're looking at detox pathways. And I would even probably extend that too, and I'm sure you're implying it, in terms of biostasis, you know, 2.5, all the things that, you know, Dr. Kelly talks about when it comes to moving that bile and going from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3 and all those things in between. The other thing I'd probably add on to that too, John, just because it's in the section when we do a genetic interpretation, is the whole histamine concept with zonulin being elevated and permeable gut membrane. So a lot of people get that concept. A lot of people understand, okay, yeah, I heard of zonulin, I heard of leaky gut, you know, so how does that make the oxalate burden more problematic if that's something that someone who's listening to this knows, okay, yeah, for sure, I know I got permeable gut membranes, but why would that make me have more oxalate issues?
Well, when you talk about, if you have leaky gut aspects and you have that histamine burden, that with leaky gut there's an inflammation aspect, and that in itself is going to disrupt the bacteria balance, and that in itself can cause an increase in oxalate formation. But then there's kind of like a vicious cycle with that, because now you're absorbing those oxalates at a higher rate, and that oxalate absorption across the gut itself can continue to cause further damage and cause further leaky gut issues. And we also know that oxalates are something that can stimulate mast cells, right? And so now that can perpetuate more histamine release. And so you do kind of have this vicious cycle with, leaky gut issues and with histamine aspects. And it's kind of rule of thumb for me that if somebody, in kind of red flag, right, the subjective things, we talk about recurrent iron or magnesium issues. If somebody comes to me and it's like, ongoing leaky gut, and it's like, oh, I know I've had leaky gut for years, I fixed it, and it just comes back. It's like histamine and oxalates are kind of those two elephants in the room, and that are factors, and a lot of times both of them are there, and because they can feed off one another in terms of the oxalates creating damage, the oxalates stimulated mast cell activation, stimulated more histamine release in the gut, and then that histamine in the gut causes zonulin levels to continue to increase and stay high, which causes more leaky gut, and just you're kind of in a cycle that you can't get your hands around until you make some dietary shifts and understand that, hey, there are other factors besides just throwing colostrum and glutamine trying to heal the gut up, rather than getting at the cause of what's driving that in the first place, which a lot of times the underlying causes are that, oxalator or histamine burden. And to kind of backtrack to what you're talking about, kind of that biosynthesis utilization, we talk about strategies for oxalates, right? We talk about dietary changes, Epsom salt baths. One thing I do with a lot of patients who have oxalate issues, because there's a lot of issues with that biosynthesis, bioutilization, and that phase 2.5, that allows for a lot of reabsorption of those metals and chemicals that then disrupts the microbiome. A lot of binders, right? You're talking about, clays and charcoals, and chlorella, those type of things to kind of aid initially and kind of mopping that stuff up, so that you can get some momentum to slow down the absorption of those oxalates from foods, along with what you're doing with the dietary restrictions, but start to stop taking stress off of what's creating or causing the imbalance in the gut bacteria in the first place, that's allowing those oxalates to get absorbed at a higher rate than they should.
Yeah, I mean, it goes so much deeper than just being gluten-free and dairy-free,
Oh, yeah.
right? I mean, and that's the thing. Like, I know, like on our radar back, when that was the thing,
Yeah.
oxalates may not have been on the radar at that point either. And I think it's really interesting the way you've put it all together with the detox component, the microbial component, the pathogenic component, the genetic component, the mitochondrial component for sure as well. All of those things. And at the end of the day, John, it comes down to what we talk about and what you talked about last time is, what's the presentation? What's the symptoms? Does it all add up?
Yeah.
And has most of the time too, like, has it been on your radar? And a lot of the times it hasn't. And I'm glad we're talking about this, because a lot of people will have an organic. Let me ask you this, just as an aside. How many people you work with who've had a Great Plains organic acid test who had in plain sight high levels of oxalates, and they were never told about that? I mean, how often does that happen?
All the time, all the time. I would say at least a couple times a month, where somebody, has had an organic acids test done, in the last year, maybe like 3 or 4 years ago, right? And you kind of bring up like, okay, yeah, that oxalates. Are you still following a low oxalate diet? We got to remeasure that. And they're like, well, no, nobody ever explained that part to them, right? It was just kind of skipped over, because they were looking at the candida, they were looking at glutathione, they were looking at the neurotransmitter metabolites, because maybe they had mood issues and didn't correlate that. Wow, all right, those oxalates can create disruption in iron that's going to affect biopterin, that's going to affect neurotransmitters. So there's a connection with the mood and oxalates, right? So I see that all the time. And what's really great, when you talk about the subjective aspect in terms of like, it walks like a duck, it talks like a duck, it may be a duck, right? How many people that they have fibromyalgia, or they have, recurring UTIs, or it's a kid on the spectrum, and we order your organic acids test on them, and I go and put them on a low to moderate oxalate diet anyways after they do the test, because that test takes 2.5 to 3 weeks to get back anyways. and boom, oxalates are elevated and we're in the right track. And a lot of times they're already starting to notice they're feeling better just by decreasing the dietary aspect. So, symptoms, can give you a lot of insight. So if someone listening to this has any of those things that we talked about, in the beginning of this, or if they've been struggling with iron issues, or they're very dependent on magnesium, and the minute they get away from magnesium, pain levels come back, or digestion really gets disrupted, or mood changes, you really want to consider how oxalates are playing into that. Consider dietary changes. Consider measuring it to have something, tangible to determine, how aggressive you need to get. Look at genetic factors to determine, do you have, some of those genes that may tell you that low oxalate lifestyle may be something you got to consider at some level the rest of your life. And then also, the elephant in the room is, hey, what is the trigger, right? What are the things like metals or chemicals that are driving that toxic accumulation in the body that could be a big factor that's driving that increased oxalate burden in the first place?
Yeah, and just to piggyback off of that, to make it a little simpler as well, because it is a very complicated subject. We're looking for root causes that would cumulatively add on to each other, and I think a lot of people get the concept of the going upstream and looking at the root cause, but it's never a pretty fuse. I call it pretty fuse box, John, where it's just you take the fuse out of the fuse box, you put it in, and everything comes back on.
Right.
It's never that easy, but oxalates can really be that unidentified trigger that really, like you said, it impacts the mast cells, it impacts histamine production, it creates vicious cycles. And ultimately, if it's a mitochondrial disruptor, those people, John, when we used to have, well, I don't have them very much anymore, but they would have, like, they'd fill out the paperwork and there's not one white piece of paper in there. It's all ink. You kind of know that that's going to be a mitochondrial based challenge, because at the end of the day, they're just not making ATP, and every cell needs ATP to function. And if cells aren't functioning, then whatever that cell forms as a tissue, detox pathways, digestion, neurological, endocrine stuff, all that stuff. So,
Yeah.
all right. So then, as far as now, they're starting to get the idea. They may have the symptoms. They're looking. People that are hearing this are understanding the test that you could see. And then potentially, so the test was the Great Plains lab. It has to be Great Plains, right? Because the other organic acid test doesn't have them on there.
Yeah, it does. Because
Correct?
Genova is one of the other big organic acids. There's a couple other ones out there that look at organic acids, like the Dutch test looks at some of the organic acid metabolites, but oxalates are not measured on that. So really, the ways to get oxalates measured are through Great Plains organic acids testing. Like I said, you can do it through LabCorp. I don't recommend that. It is a whole lot cheaper, but it's not a very viable source from a measurement standpoint. And a lot of people kind of agree on that. So, Great Plains is the best way to go about that.
Right, and then of course the genetic component, as we look at the genes, and I guess we could even go even deeper if we wanted to in terms of what makes up the toxic accumulation genes. So maybe talk a little bit about that without going too deep into that, in terms of, okay, well, here's where we start to see perfect storms. So how are these perfect storms set up for the toxic accumulator and the person that has oxalates and GI issues? And it may not manifest as a GI symptom. It could manifest as your pain or your brain fog or your anxiety. So what would be the genetic things that they would be looking at as we teach?
Yeah, so oxalates you really, like you mentioned, can be kind of put into a couple different genetic types that we teach. The mitochondrial aspect, it's got to be on the radar. Histamine component, it's got to be on the radar as well. But where the biggest one is that toxic accumulator, and a couple of reasons. Because we know that people typically that have issues with detoxification, issues with clearing metals, clearing chemicals, more often than not, oxalates are going to be a factor, right? There's going to be disruption of the gut microbiome. There's going to be increase in yeast or candida formation. And because of all that, you're going to see elevated oxalates as well. So the dietary game plan for somebody that has detoxification issues is going to be initially kind of that low to moderate oxalate diet. Anybody that has sensitivity to supplements, anybody that has sensitivity to medications, You want to consider, oxalates as a piece of that, because you're probably that toxic accumulator. Your body's just so toxic that that immune system is so stressed. But from a genetic standpoint, really this toxic accumulator deals with a lot with peroxidation pathways. So we're talking about genes like glutathione peroxidase, catalase, SOD function. Those are some of the key factors that kind of deal with that. And then further upstream, there's some other things that deal with like methylation activity that can fall into it. But where we see a lot of the issues and kind of starting points with those that are toxic accumulators deals with oxidation. Right? And really what that means is how the body takes inflammation and free radicals and converts it into water, how it breaks it down through all these different steps. And where oxalates can fall into that is if somebody has detox issues, then that oxalate burden increases. But then also some of those essential elements in that peroxidation pathway, like iron, for instance, be disrupted by that oxalate burden that can even put more of an impact on how somebody can clear those metals and chemicals that causes that inflammation and free radicals to hang around at a higher abundance. It just really kind of makes them more and more sensitive each and every single year.
Right. So, okay. So then as far as you did mention the big five in terms of spinach, beets, parsley, Swiss chard, rhubarb, those are the main five, over 500 milligrams per serving.
Yeah.
And ideally somewhere between 150 to 200 per day. So you're blowing your wad on one thing. But let's talk about the challenges with going cold turkey or saying, okay, yeah, I eat a lot of spinach. What are the recommendations with that, John?
Yeah. So, there's some different things in terms of like how you want to go about this, in terms of making that lifestyle change, because if it's something that you're doing a spinach and berry smoothie every single day and you've got this oxalate bomb that you're doing, that's adding more fuel to the fire, right? And, it's like one man's food can be another man's poison, right? That could be something that could be doing a whole lot more harm than good. And I have had many patients over the years that, we had a talk, hey, we got to stop doing those, stop juicing, stop doing those smoothies temporarily, or change what we're juicing or making smoothies in, because that oxalate burden is just way too high. So you don't want to stop cold turkey. You don't want to just jump in and take hey, I'm eating a diet that's really high in oxalates. I'm eating a paleo diet. I'm doing spinach and nuts and I'm having coffee every day, and just stop it all cold turkey, because then what's going to happen is the body's going to recognize that stressor is gone, and you're going to have an abundance of dumping of those oxalates, which then can create a lot of issues, right? Can really affect and create like a lot of detox effects, right? Create a UTI. Ramp up pain levels. There's a lot of things that can happen. So rule of thumb is you want baby steps. And they always say you want to do about 15 to 20%, per week. But how do you measure that? Unless you're doing organic acids a couple times a week to kind of measure that oxalate count, it's very, very hard, So usually take baby steps, and we say, all right, of those foods you're doing, if you're not journaling, we just start kind of making choices where we kind of shift to, all right, hey, if we've been eating a high oxalate food every single meal, we maybe initially shift that to where maybe we're only doing once a day, right? And then we shift it to where we're doing it every other day, to the point where now we're following a low to moderate oxalate diet with those other things that you should be doing, looking at genetics, looking at these other stressors, increase in magnesium intake, doing Epsom salt baths, consider, B6 and certain probiotics. There's a lot of different strategies, and it's really not a one size fits all. Although the one size fits all scenarios are making dietary shifts, magnesium increases, and I would say binders, binders such as chlorella, bentonite clay, activated charcoal, those type of things, along with supporting some of that kind of bile stagnation that can happen a lot of times as well. And then from there, it's really kind of maybe customized to genetics and some other aspects, but you definitely want to do it at a slow rate. You don't want to kind of jump in and say, oh my gosh, I think I have oxalates, and you just stop cold turkey, because what happens is now you got a full-blown UTI, you got to give it an antibiotic, and now you disrupt the gut microbiome more, which then in turn is going to cause the oxalate burden high. And then your mindset, you're like, well, it must not be oxalates because I did the low oxalates and it made me worse. It must be something else. Not making that association that you just dump oxalates way too fast that put more stress on the body.
Yeah, and we said in our last talk, John, we talked about if the presentation lines up, right? So
right.
If you have the presentation and then you have the findings on the test, and the symptoms match, then it's straightforward. And it's never completely straightforward, but the majority of the people listening to this will have the great impact with everything that they can do to minimize their oxalates and binders and then so forth and so on. But where it becomes more difficult is, unfortunately, the perfect storm patient who has seen so many different providers, and they do have things that are toxic accumulating in their body. They do have toxic accumulating type SNPs that we identify, and they have histamine and mast cell issues. Besides just the oxalate stimulating the mast cells, there's potential EMFs and excess dopamine and iron overload and all of those other things. That's where we suggest you work with someone, or just, you know, inundate yourself with the tools that we provide. So that's a good segue, John, to what are the tools we provide and how can they find out about that?
Yeah, so you know, we do have some educational things that we have available. The Your Genetic Type Unlock course can really help provide a lot of guidance and give a lot of people starting points on how some of the genetic factors, couple with symptoms you're experiencing, couple with a lot of these epigenetic stressors like oxalates primarily, or metals, or other chemicals, you know, the things we spoke about today. And what are some of the strategies in terms of, you know, what are tests to consider? What are some of the dietary means you should follow? And what are supplemental or foundational supplemental things you should take based on your key genetic type? And so we've got you know, resources available. We're putting more and more resources together. We're also have available here really soon in the next, you know, few days, you know, certain support products that that we're creating to help support some of these foundational genetic type aspects as well. So a lot of that, all that information is on our website, yourgenetictype.com. So if you're listening to this on Facebook or somewhere else, you know, explore that website, explore the resources we have, and you know, understand how your genetic type and understanding your genetic type can be a big kind of foundational step in the right direction to get answers and get you on the road to recovery.
Yeah, absolutely. And always realize that if you're feeling overwhelmed from the information that we're giving you, but you're already involved with your own healthcare and you're doing a lot of work, keep taking steps forwards, because I found, and I'm sure John will tell you as well, that like we said, when we look at someone's organic acid test and we said, okay, so what's going on with your oxalates now? If you know, they're like, what do you
Yeah.
mean? Like,
What do you mean?
I don't
What is
even
that?
know what was going on then, right? And
Oxalates.
so, yeah, so this is something that a lot of professionals don't understand themselves, and they're not taught. And now you understand that it needs to be on your radar. You need to understand potentially what are the foods that can make a more burdensome, and then ultimately understand your genetic component and understand what you can do to mitigate that. And that's the other thing too, I guess I would say, John, is maybe explain, when you understand the genetic component, how it changes the prognosis from, okay, we got rid of it, to, okay, now we got a verb kind of thing. Like maybe talk about that.
Yeah, I think that's key with any of the things, the genetic types we talk about too, the histamine type or even this toxic accumulator type, that where oxalates kind of fall into. Or if somebody is like kind of that weak cellular type and they do determine that there's an oxalate issue as well. If there are some certain gene factors that are associated with this, you know, you have to understand that, you know, if you loosen the reins too much on a story like this, on an answer that you find, you know, high likelihood a lot of stuff's going to start creeping back on you. And that's something that I see with clients all the time is, you know, I don't hear from them for a year, and, you know, things start creeping back up on them. And the first thing is like, all right, have you, you know, how's the diet been? Have you loosened the reins too much on a low to moderate oxalate diet, right? Because as you get better, you know, you can loosen the reins a little bit, but if you loosen them too much, that can be problematic. And more often than not, it's like, well, yeah, it was the holidays. I kind of really fell apart, you know, not only the gluten, the dairy, the sugar intake, but it's like I was eating high oxalate foods and I was still eating healthy, but it incorporate a lot of these high oxalate foods back into the mix. And it's like within a couple of weeks of doing that, hey, things started kind of creeping back up on me. And so the genetic aspect does give a lot of insight into exit strategy, right? What is that exit strategy in terms of like, what are the things you have to consider doing, or things you have to consider that are on your radar that you have to have an understanding about going forward. When I tell clients this with the oxalates, I say, hey, we know this is an issue. We're going to get it under control, and then time will tell in terms of how much we can loosen the reins. Genetics gives us a little insight into some of the flexibility, but it does give us insight that we have to have an understanding that if you go back and eat spinach and do spinach smoothies every single day, high likelihood you're going to feel lousy in a couple of weeks. There's got to be some moderation. And spinach is a great food. It's a superfood, right? Beets, superfood. Tons of benefits. That's beets drive nitric oxide. There's so many benefits of that. It's just some of those foods have to be in moderation with people that have oxalate issues. And if they increase it too much, symptoms are going to come back.
Yeah, and I think that's apropos for the name Your Genetic Type, because now okay, my weakness is I'm a toxic accumulator, which makes it much more, and I happen to have genetic challenges in the histamine type, which would make oxalates more profound. So I can fall off the wagon, so to speak, a little bit, but where the chain is going to break is going to be that 30,000 view symptom of fill in the blank, brain fog, musculoskeletal pain, fibromyalgia. And if those are starting to come around and you've already put the homework and put the dedication to understand what your Achilles heel is, now like you've taught me, now like, okay, this is where you have to invest more of your time for what worked before, and we just kind of got off track. So awesome content today, John.
Yeah.
So as far as, and then the last thing I would say is there is a mini quiz that they can take at yourgenetictype.com. That's you take a free quiz and it gives you some insights into what your genetic type is. And like you said, we have the tool of the unlocked course, and even the testing too, right? So they can get the organic acid, which does, I know for sure, ship overseas as well. And then what we're looking to do is provide as much value as we can for you guys. So it's a one-stop shop, so to speak, where, hey, now we know I'm a toxic accumulator. I also have challenges with oxalates. I confirmed it with the test. And these are the formulations that I can get for my genetic type at yourgenetictype.com. So those are exciting stuff that we have going for you guys. Make sure that you subscribe to our YouTube channel, Your Genetic Type. Make sure you check out our Facebook page, Your Genetic Type, and then this will be a podcast that we upload to iTunes. And make sure that you share or like or comment or give us feedback on how we can support you in your ability to control your biology and to get results faster. So from Dr. John Thomas and myself, hope you guys have an awesome rest of your day, and we look forward to helping you guys down in the future. Take care.